I clicked the play button, but it just said your browser failed to play, and then I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen.
Right.
But yeah, I'm here with Trent Horn. So a lot of you, I guess, are probably going to be familiar with Trent's stuff to do with Catholic apologetics. I mean, you've got a relatively big channel where you do that sort of stuff. You have recently had a debate with Ben Watkins, which I think most people will have seen who are interested in the kind of atheism, theism debates.
Yeah.
And then the one I did recently that we were just sort of talking about, which was the first thing that you became familiar with me through, was this discussion with Jay Dyer about the role of natural theology for Christians. Right. You know, what role should it play in apologetics? And I guess I was mostly critical of Jay's. I think I actually do align with some of Jay's positions relatively closely in terms of some of the stuff he's saying about, well, I don't know, maybe not so much. We can talk about that, but I think what I disagreed with most is his kind of attitude towards engaging in the dialogue and the discussion, and that's where most of my criticisms come from. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about that.
No, I think that, and this is something that I kind of expected. So how that debate came about was I have a policy on my channel, like I'll do rebuttals of content that is critical of the Catholic faith, and to avoid a spiral of endless rebuttals, because somebody could rebut what I just said and then I'll respond to them. I believe in cutting through the red tape. And so I usually what I'll do, my policy is I'll do a rebuttal. If someone rebuts me, then I will offer, I'll offer to do a debate instead, or a dialogue, or some kind of public engagement of some kind. And I offer, but it's not always the same thing that I'll offer to people, because there are some individuals out there who are just very difficult to have a conversation with. They can be very antagonistic or dense or both, which is the worst combination. And so, it's not as fruitful or productive. So usually I'll offer a debate for people that I feel like aren't as great at the dialogue, but there's some people I just really enjoy them. Whether like on the atheist side, people like Joe Schmidt or Ben Watkins, or on the Protestant side, somebody like Gavin Ortland, which I want to hopefully engage with soon. I could just sit down and have a chat with them. So with Jay, I said, hey, why don't we could do a debate if you want. And I actually offered to Jay, do you want to debate the papacy? Because I mean, that is like the central thing that kind of divides Catholics and Orthodox. And he said the papacy's been debated a bunch. Let's debate natural theology. So I thought, well, all right, if that's what you want to do. Because I had previously done a rebuttal to his a video that he did, 10 reasons why he's not Catholic. And it was interesting. That's when I first kind of got, what's what I'm looking for here, introduced to Jay's style, which can be it's kind of like a shotgun approach, of a sense of, I'm going to throw out all of this stuff that I've read, and very quickly in a very cursory manner. And that's supposed to be impressive. Well, what impresses me is when you methodically go through an argument. So that's that. So I had that thought that he might act like that way in the debate, and it was interesting for sure. I think you noticed that too.
Yeah, I think the main engagement I had with Jay was I talked to him in his Discord server about 2 or 3 years ago once, but then he did a debate with Alex Malpass about, I think it was about the same, well, not about natural theology, but about this
the transcendental argument.
Yeah, right. And some of these same sort of issues came up where, well, I suppose he'd say things, and then Alex would say, well, here's the actual quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics, this book, this chapter, here's what it says, there's 2 ways of interpreting it, these are the ways. And then rather than kind of engage with the content of what Alex was saying, there'd be a lot of exposition about the entire history of Western philosophy, loads of names dropped, but it wasn't clear what the actual point was, or what progress could be made. Yeah,
it's a lot of talking without saying very much. And I watched that debate to prepare or that engagement, I should say, to prepare for my own debate with Jay. And what I noticed is Alex, and of course, Alex is coming from a different perspective than I. Like, both Jay and I believe God exists. We believe in, well, I don't know, maybe Jay's perspective, I don't believe God exists
Well,
because
those
it's
intentional contexts, yeah.
right. It's a rigid designator. Apparently, I'm an atheist because I don't believe in his exact Eastern Orthodox theology. I don't know, but Alex, comes from a naturalist perspective and was just trying to wrap his head around this transcendental argument. And that's what I was trying to wrap my head around too with Jay. And I noticed Alex would keep asking him, "Can you just give me some premises?" And like he just refused. And that's why I'm skeptical of some individuals, both on the Christian side and the atheist side, who kind of make a big splash on like YouTube or doing debates, and they're really good at rhetoric, but you can't actually find them having written down their thoughts on issues. So, like Jay might be an example of that. Jay's got like all of these like videos and live streams, and there's other individuals too in the Protestant world that do this. Although some that write, they write terribly, so that's not a help to them. But even in the atheist world, you have someone like Matt Dillahunty who does like tons of debates and has that kind of aggressive style. But then I just can't find it written down in a concise manner to like figure out where the argument is going. That if you can't do that, sometimes I think you're kind of big on rhetoric.
Yeah, I think the way that you put it across to him really helped to clarify things. Where you put it in the form of that dilemma that either basically he's begging the question, or he is engaging in natural theology, right? And so if he's begging the question, then there's a problem because that's just fallacious, or it's not going to be convincing to anyone. And
Yeah.
if he is engaging in natural theology, well, then he's lost the debate because he's using natural theology to try and convince the person of his
Yeah,
position.
and I never really got my handle on what his response to the dilemma was. I think he wanted to try to say, well, it is circular reasoning. And he would almost talk out of both sides of his mouth that sometimes, and I hear this from some presuppositionalists, that, well, circular reasoning is vicious, but it can also be virtuous at a certain level. And to me, that's just special pleading. That is just trying to excise your particular claim. But then Jay, in other contexts, would say in the debate, well, we all do, and some of his fans and other presups will say, well, we all do circular reasoning. All reasoning is circular. And then, so I have like two thoughts on that claim. One, if all reasoning is circular, then that wouldn't show you should be a presuppositionalist. That would just show reasoning doesn't exist. We can't validly reason, which seems totally false. But then number two, if all reasoning is circular, fine, then I'm going to say Catholicism is true because Catholicism is true. Who cares if it's circular? I thought all reasoning was circular. So I just, when I see people gravitate towards that, and I think you and I you can appreciate this, I just want people to have the best arguments on each side. And I just think that presuppositional thought, while there are kernels of truth that are interesting there, it just leads people towards it. It reminds me of Calvinism, and I don't think it's a surprise that a lot of Calvinists are presuppositionalists, that it's like this audacious kind of, yeah, I know that this is crazy and offensive, but guess what? I don't care about your feelings. I'm just going to say it. Where they don't care if they're like logically or ethically offensive. Bruh, that's your problem. I don't know if I'm making sense here.
No, that does make sense. I think as an apologetic, there's a couple of things that's going on. I mean, one of those things is in terms of trying to provide someone else reasons to persuade them, right? And it's not going to be persuasive to just sort of tell someone to describe what you believe, but not tell someone else, give someone else reasons that are going to actually move them at all. I don't think it helps from that point of view. But the second reason I think it kind of fails as an apologetic is that the sort of ethical thing where I don't think anyone's going to change their mind if the person's just being nasty and horrible to them, basically.
And that's the other thing. I mean, there's some presuppositionalist thinkers that are courteous and would be charitable. Though I think a lot of them, they really have to lean on rhetoric. Whenever I've seen them, I saw this in a debate with Doug Wilson and others. They really kind of lean into the rhetoric that they know their position sounds totally bonkers, and they kind of just have to kind of go with it. So you can't approach it in any timid way or people won't take it seriously. It's like, this is so crazy, maybe it has to work or something like that. And just of the sheer appeal to this kind of circular approach. But it was just interesting with Jay because I just wanted to know, okay, it's one thing to try to use presuppositional arguments to just show that God exists. I mean, I can kind of get that because you run it backwards to say, well, there are things, logic, ethics, what have you. There needs to be an ultimate infinite grounding of them. That's God. It's kind of transcendental, depending on the direction you run with it. But to use this reasoning to say, oh, by the way, it's this argument shows that Eastern Orthodox conceptions of God are the correct religion. And it's not just God, but the Incarnation, Eastern theology. I'm like, that's audacious. Like you try to carry this kind of load, you know?
Yeah, and I do think there is. I mean, this is just one of the horns of the dilemma, but I think there's something very strange about this idea that, well, let's not do natural theology, but actually there has to be some kind of explanation for the intelligibility of reality, or for the, it's like, well, but that just is an argument that there's
Right.
some necessary
And the
conditional. Yeah.
explanation has to be this very narrow theology. Um, yeah, so I don't know, but I mean I'm not gonna dunk on
Right.
them too much. So I mean it's fun to discuss it a little bit. Um, but I appreciated your engagement of it, and you've done a lot of engagement with other apologetics. I've really appreciated just kind of like in the past. I mean, I haven't been doing YouTube for a long time, really, but seeing that there's kind of a movement towards like raising the level of dialogue, both between Christians and atheists or Catholics and Protestants, and even Orthodox and Catholic. Like you've got like the people that are just the worst, that just like the slugfest, but others that are raising the dialogue and pointing out where there's the weaker arguments, the better arguments. I think that's something we can all agree on.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult thing to do, especially with these sort of beliefs that are so foundational and so core to who we are as well. To sort of have these conversations and keep them cordial, because it can feel very personal if someone is challenging those things, or if there's the possibility of you changing your mind about something that's so core.
Yeah.
And then also, the idea of almost like a status, or you've got people who kind of follow you and expect something from you, and then the idea is, well, what if I change my mind? What are they going to think about me? And for me, those have been really difficult things to get over, and to like say, well, actually having a virtuous conversation with someone is going to be better than pleasing what some people of my audience want to see and be entertained in this particular kind of way. So yeah, I think it's difficult, and people on all sides sort of suffer from these various different sort of causes of vices, maybe one might say, in conversations.
Well, I mean, everybody deals with confirmation bias, and then everyone has to deal with, the thought of changing one's worldview. I mean, it's dramatic. I did that 20 years ago. I've still refined my particular worldview. You yourself have been kind of on a journey for your own worldview, it seems like.
Yeah, I did want to say something actually about so my recent thinking though about about religious belief and particularly faith and what faith might mean has been maybe would be more sympathetic to something like what Jay was arguing. So I understand your position in that debate was that natural theology, so someone through reason can come to an understanding that a god exists or something like that, right? But it's kind of like this bare bones theism. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think the arguments. Well, I mean, it depends on the tradition you're in. I am part of the classical theist tradition, so I think one can get a very robust version of theism, but that would just be the philosophical arguments. The next step would be historical analysis to see if it's been revealed in a certain religion. But through just the philosophical arguments, like I know there, I don't know, I think Richard Swinburne tried to argue for the Trinity just from reason alone, and I don't think those arguments work. But I think you can get a pretty robust theism. But to get to a particular religion, I think you'd need historical reasoning.
I think so. From my point of view, I definitely think that someone can rationally believe in God on the basis of these arguments. But I also find, at least from my position, that there's such vast literature on all of them and each of the positions that they take, and it, for me at least, it doesn't seem conclusive either way. And then through a process of introspection, then about my reason, about the bounds of my reason, I sort of think, well, how much am I a slave of my desires here? Like when I've been upset with Christianity, I've been inclined to use my reason to find arguments that are quite strong against these proofs from natural theology. When I initially was a Christian, I used my reason and found these arguments very compelling and very strong. And any objection someone gave, I would be able to reason it away, as it were. And I have been wondering, what the limits of reason are, and from within Christianity, if there's this kind of story about
Yeah.
sin. I mean, I think Augustine talks about well, for Augustine, faith is obviously a gift from God, but there's also
Right.
this kind of aspect of moral character, I suppose, that comes into how we employ our reason. And similarly for Aquinas, faith goes beyond reason in a sense. There are certain
Right.
truths, and I have been kind of grappling with this idea of, how much really is reason this kind of autonomous thing that can give me this view from nowhere that I can just assess whether or not God exists, versus
Yeah.
how much really does the Christian story about sin and the grace of God play a role in someone coming to develop these beliefs in God. And I have not been able to reason my way through that, as it were.
Right. Yeah. And I think, though, it's going to really depend on the individual. People are all very different. I believe, and as I said in the debate, it can be rationally justified to believe God exists apart from rational arguments. I mean, I'm not going down like the William Lane Craig witness of the Holy Spirit per se, but I've firmly always held that you can know something is true without being able to show it to other people, and that the human person can access parts of reality directly and maybe not be able to show that to others. That we have more than five empirical senses. We can intuit things. We can sense certain things and be aware of that, even if we can't show other people. I see the arguments. I think the Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 35 talks about how they can't move someone to faith in God, but they can predispose someone to it. So I think at the bare minimum, I find them to be helpful, at least to make the concept of God to be something respectable, intelligible, something for the will to try, something for the mind to try to wrap itself around, than just something that is just completely silly and off-putting, and you wouldn't give it a moment's thought.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is the case, but I do genuinely really struggle especially when I consider my own experiences of this. Where I
Mm.
think when I think, well, what why did I suddenly stop finding like certain theistic arguments compelling? Well, I think it was because I was very upset with the way I'd been hurt by the church, and then my
Oh, I'm
reason just
sorry to
figured
hear
out a
that.
way to solve it. Well, it's okay, but it's nothing to do with you.
Oh,
But then I
right.
think, well, why did
But it's a good observation. A lot of people don't even catch that.
But then I think, why did it become why did some of these arguments become more appealing to me again? And then I was
Mhm.
thinking, well, maybe I grew a bit tired of the kind of comments I was getting for tribalistic comments through YouTube and things, which were saying, "Oh, it's great that you kind of destroy this argument or whatever." I just grew tired of that. My passions
Oh, you
changed,
mean
and
you
then
mean from non-theists?
yeah, I do. I
Mhm.
mean, so again, my desires changed, and then all of a sudden, I began to think, well, um, Christianity all of a sudden is more intellectually compelling again,
Mhm.
and it's this really bizarre thing where and it is kind of strange because it's like, well, can such a thing be distinguished from wishful thinking or confirmation biases and that sort of stuff? And maybe it can in some sense, because it's not exactly it's wishful thinking to develop a belief on the basis that you want it to be true, but it's not wishful thinking to sort of hope in
Yeah,
something.
I don't
Yeah,
think that that's wrong at all. I mean, there's nothing wrong with hoping that good things exist. There's nothing wrong with hoping that things are good. I think I think if you didn't live that way, like one's mental health would be at risk. Now I don't. Now I think wishful thinking happens when there's two like gradations, I guess. When you hope for a good in the face of defeating evidence, that's when it's like it's just kind of really sad to see, versus then hoping for a good in the face of no, like there's no good evidence for it. It's like the person, like let's say like somebody who hopes that they won last week's lottery, even though somebody else has been declared the winner. That's just really depressing and off. That's you worry about their mental health. or somebody who's in debt and they hope they'll win this week's lottery, even though the odds are fantastically against them. There's nothing wrong per se, but if they put all their hope into that, it's very sad. So I guess when it comes back to the arguments for God, I guess we have to think like how the odds of them being successful. I don't think they're remote like the lottery. I believe they ultimately are successful. But even if you weren't convinced by them, I think you could see them, as kind of a force to be reckoned with. Oh, one other point that I want to bring up, because you were mentioning about the atheist community, and I think this is interesting how you're saying tribalism and going against that. I feel for people who I was reading an article the other day on Pathos non-religious, and it was a female writer talking about the scandal with Josh Duggar. Like, are you familiar with that scandal?
I'm not familiar with it. No.
Oh, okay. So Josh Duggar was part of a reality TV series. Like, it was about this fundamentalist kind of, or at least very conservative evangelical Christian family that had like 17 kids. And so it's something where it's like a lot of people who identify as atheists have come out of things like that, and they're very bitter, and they had bad experiences and they reject that theology really rigorously, and it sickens them to see this family being celebrated on TV. But then there's been a series of scandals with Josh Duggar that he molested one of his sisters when he was younger, and then he cheated on his wife, and now finally he's going to jail for child pornography. And this Pathos writer was just going on like, this shows when you put Christians in charge, what happens, and their God can't help them, and this is not what we want. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's sad, but you can't pin this kind of stuff just on Christianity. Like, anywhere you go, you're gonna get hypocritical people, scandalous people. And I think that some people, like, when they flee to another community, it's like grass is greener, even if it's within religions or away from religion. It's like, oh, great. But then when you're in it for a bit, you're like, wait a minute, all the stuff I didn't like before, it starts coming back again. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it definitely does make sense. I mean, I do think I think certain belief systems exacerbate it more than others. And I
Sure.
think what's interesting is that, I personally think in terms of the structure of the belief, I think a kind of evangelical fundamentalist Baptist type Christianity is quite similar to certain atheist communities in America that have come out of that system, where it's like
Right.
the structures remain the same, the evangelism and everything, but the content has just been swapped out for the opposite. It's just defined by, well, I used to really care about abortion, about being against abortion. Now I'm really for abortion. Like every belief is just flipped, but the structure is the exact same.
Right. The attitudes are interesting. It's like one reason I think Matt Dillahunty is very successful online, and he attracts a lot of followers, is that, well, he was actually, I think, training, or people were telling him he should be a pastor. And the way he kind of talks when he does his videos or he's in debates, the cadence and examples and attitude reminds me of like some very conservative pastors that do debates, kind of very forthright, commonsensical thinking that I don't have to nuance. So I think you're right. I've thought about writing about this more. Like, you leave fundamentalist Christianity, you embrace a kind of fundamentalist atheism, and the same problems can show up, even like the really like, darker kind of things. Like, they had those scandals at atheist conferences a few years ago about like sexual harassment. And I noticed online the other day, there was like this debate about the atheist, like, does the atheist community exist? If atheism is just a lack of belief, then there can't be a community of atheists. Like, there's no community of non-stamp collectors. But that just seems false to me. There's people who like to gather in Discord channels and groups and go to conferences and wear t-shirts, and they have YouTubers they follow. It looks really similar to this, like the fans that follow atheist apologists, and I could use the term apologist, reminds me of the people who follow Ray Comfort or Frank Turek. Like, and they act very similarly.
Yeah, I think, I mean, on something like that, there's always going to be an argument someone can make about how it's really difficult to define because it's vague, and it's going to be like, well, how do you define a game, or where does the economy begin and end, sort of thing. But clearly, it does exist. It's just going to be, there's going to be a gross oversimplification of,
Yeah, you just pick it. In those cases where you have a hard time with coming up with a definition, you can say, well, if you don't have a solid definition, here's an example that seems like really clear. So yeah, but I have noticed this, and that's why there's certain individuals I've really enjoyed online. People like Real A Theology, even people I have, obviously profound disagreements with, Real A Theology, Randall Rouser, others that are willing to think it through and say things that'll upset the base. I mean, I think that's a real mark of whether someone is intellectually honest or not. Like you watch certain people and you wonder, like, have they crafted a message solely to grow and appease a base of followers, or are they willing to be critical and to take unpopular stances? And I try to, there's always temptations like that for me. Like, it's funny, I know there's some topics my YouTube channel followers would love for me to talk about nonstop, and other things that I think are important that I'd like to talk about they don't want to hear about. So I think that's the line people need to walk.
So I had build tonight's conversation as sort of, well, why, should you become a Catholic, right? And,
Yeah, sure.
and I wonder, in terms of my journey,
Sure.
I mean, maybe it would be worth just leaving aside the sort of question of theism or Christian belief, whatever, because I don't, there's plenty of conversations out there about
Yeah.
what should you think about the Kalam, what should you think about the contingency argument, what should you think about the resurrection or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
But specifically Catholicism, because I mean, I'm in a position where, but interestingly, not for any of those arguments, but where I'm, investigating Christianity,
right,
again, and going to liturgy in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's on a Saturday with this particular church, but I've been exploring different denominations. I've gone to like an Episcopal church, a Church of England Anglican church when I was in England for a bit. I'm in Scotland at the minute.
You were Christian, though. You left Christianity. What did you grow up in?
I grew up nothing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, the Church of England sort of has a latent residual presence in primary schools in the UK, but it's
right.
It's like there's a hymn in assembly before school,
God
or
save
something
the
like
Queen.
that. Well, not quite. Yeah, I think it was there was Kumbaya and give me oil in my lamp or something.
Yeah,
those sorts of things. And so
okay.
so I mean, there would be some influence on my beliefs, and obviously there's a cultural sort of, Christianity is a big cultural part of sort of what it is to be British, and our historical legal systems, and
Right.
our history is tied up with the Reformation and the split between Catholicism and everything. But it was only when I was about 18 that I began to that I sort of came into Christianity, and I hadn't really thought about the theology or anything at the time. So I ended up, going to quite an evangelical Calvinist type church, having not really thought about any of the available options. And then over time, I adopted some of their beliefs, and then I think they became less intellectually appealing to me, and my desires changed through that, through some sort of experiences of like someone overstepping the boundaries of where they should have given personal advice, and giving really bad and harmful personal advice. And I think that made me, sort of think, well, is this like, well, I don't like this person, or I don't like this community. Is there some reason I can kind of leave it or figure out why this person's wrong? Because they were very overzealous as well in their beliefs and commitments. So yeah, once I came out of that, I sort of went more towards agnosticism. I would have described myself as a pretty confident naturalist at least about a year ago. Now, not so confident on those sorts of things. Now I'm pretty much epistemically agnostic on most of these metaphysical issues, because I just find them so complicated and complex. But yeah, so my experience has been in the Church of England, but like the Low Church, where it's evangelical. It's not Anglo-Catholic or anything. And now I'm finding, I mean, I definitely
you're getting more high. You're getting more high church, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've gone to a few, even because I'm in Glasgow at the minute. I've gone to the Metropolitan Cathedral in Glasgow, and the Catholic Cathedral, and sat through a few of the services there. And definitely the kind of beauty resonates with me. The history, the historical liturgy, rather than kind of these 100-year-old songs about Jesus made us boys and girls or something, which is like it's a bit sort of.
Well, it's interesting. We are kind of going through a little bit of a decision time in our household about what parish to go to. We had been going to an Eastern, for the past 2 years, we had been going to a Byzantine Catholic church. So this would be the Eastern Rite of the Catholic Church. It's Ruthenian, and it actually comes out of back in this, I want to say, 16th century. This was a Eastern Orthodox church that was brought back into communion with the Catholic Church. And so its liturgy it's almost identical to Eastern Orthodoxy, but it's in communion with the Pope and a few other differences. And we did that because for those similar reasons. I love the antiquity. I just got tired. I don't like the hymns, singing worship songs that are about myself. Like I don't like singing songs in church about what I'm going to do. I'm not there for that. I love songs that are lofty and are, because I'm not a big touchy feely person in the sense of warm fuzzy spiritual feelings, but I get that at the Divine Liturgy, and I'm like, oh, I feel like it lifts us up to God, and we're just singing about how great God is with these hymns that are very theologically precise. The only problem is now that that church that we go to is about 40 minutes away from our home. There's a really nice Western Latin Rite Catholic parish right nearby us, where a lot of our friends and community goes. So the Byzantine Divine Liturgy might turn into a once a month treat for us. But I totally understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, I think there's this big difference. I mean, I definitely am a fan of some of the more traditional Anglican hymns, and I do miss some of those. But the tendency in the Low Church is to avoid them anyway, because there's
Right.
almost this sort of Puritan idea. I don't know, that it becomes about worshiping the song or something rather than. So then you get these sort of poppy. I don't know. They just don't have any depth to them. I don't know what it is. There isn't any like oomph to the meaning of the lyrics. They're almost just just the propositions of tulip or something spelt out in in these basic verses, set to a guitar and drums. So I don't like that much.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I think what I enjoy about Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, as well as, it's not just the idea of the tradition, but it's that there's this long history of sort of embodying the story of the Incarnation through participating in the liturgy and through also through the architecture of the church. It's all about that. I find the whole experience sort of elevates my mind to the mystery of the essence of God, which in my view is sort of fundamentally unknowable in some sense, but also thinking about the incarnational nature of Christ through the artistry of the church and the way that the church is kind of physically there and trying to symbolize and embody these ideals, and that that feels
I think no, I totally agree with you. I cannot stand bad church architecture. When I was in San Diego before we went to this Byzantine church, we went to the Mission because it was made like two. I mean, in Europe this doesn't sound ancient, but a 250-year-old church is ancient in America. To have something different than just something that was built in the 70s. But what you're saying about incarnational, but prior to this interview, I was in the drive-through grabbing a bite to eat at McDonald's, and I'm not ashamed to say that. And I was it's sometimes had my greatest thoughts there, And so I was just thinking, what is it I love about classical Christian theism? And what I love about classical Christian theism is that I thought about tweeting this and just letting it be, and people can fight over it. That which is actus purus can give me a hug in heaven. Because like a struggle that I have is like I really love classical theism because I believe it provides, like, if I'm going to believe in God, he's got to have ultimate explanatory power. Like if my ex like I'm either going to have an infinite explanations, brute facts, or some kind of explanation that's ultimate in nature. And so that's why there's a lot of conceptions of God in process theology or other views of God, where I feel like God's existence is kind of, and he's limited in certain attributes. It doesn't seem quite ultimate to me. So like you have in Thomism and classical theism, actus purus, infinite, not a person, not a being, but being infinite. although he's usually often defined by what God is not, unchangeable, not temporal, not material, not this, not that. God does not have a mind. God doesn't think like you and I do. Everything is infinite and immediate and present for God. But it's hard because that version of God can feel very impersonal and distant. It's hard for me like when it is hard for me. Like I'll talk to people and they'll have these kind of like pious, like praying to God and having this emotional relationship. But like in the back of my mind, I know God doesn't actually like tear up. He's not wondering what I'm doing. He's not thinking about things. Like it's hard for me. Like I know intellectually, like God is just so radically different from me as a person. I mean, I can pray, but then the problem is I think about it too much. So then I'm like, well, but the fact that God became man, and like I'll go to heaven, and there's going to be this. I imagine Jesus is probably going to be like a 5'5" Middle Eastern looking guy, and he'll give me a hug, and I'll be taller than him. I always bum out my wife and other people when they're like, "What'll Jesus be like in heaven?" I'm like, probably not Aryan Jesus. Probably not blonde hair, blue eyed, 6 foot tall Jesus. I imagine when I give Jesus a hug in heaven, he'll be like this, the height of my wife. Because obviously 2,000 years ago, if Jesus were 6 foot tall, they would have thought he was Goliath, because people had much, you didn't have heights like we had today, except for modern medicine and nutrition and stuff. But the fact that which is actus purus will just be able to give me a hug, will be able to be materially present to me. So this incarnational idea that resonates with me. Sorry, I went on for a bit, but that was a nice prompt to share what I was mulling about
Yeah,
in the
yeah, it's
drive-through.
okay. Yeah, I do actually think that I think that on this particular model of God, and I think atheists and theists who believe in this kind of God are actually closer than they realize,
Mm,
because there's a lot of understanding. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, where atheists will generally say, well, you can't point to God through any with any, you can't just go it's that, or point to any being, point to any sense perception and go, well, that's clearly God. You can't really tell me what God is. And I think that fits perfectly almost with this classical theistic idea where, yeah, that's right, I can't point to any sense perception, right? Or if God's being it himself, but he's not any of these things, I can only talk about God by analogy through them. And
right.
it's very like the kind of mystical tradition of theology, the writings of pseudo Dionysius, where it kind of works you up through these degrees of being, and it's like, well, but it's not, God is not this, but then he's not that, and you get
Right.
this kind of everything's negated, and there's just just mystery left almost when you get to the pure essence of God, and it's
Yeah.
very close to nothing. It's very, and so the
That's
atheist
that's
is
where
saying
the
it's
danger
nothing.
lies. Yeah, that's where the danger lies. That's why I recommend to atheists. Well, it's interesting. Like if you want like a book on the existence of God, there's a lot of different ones. Argument wise, I really enjoyed Ed Fazer's book, Five Proofs for the Existence of God, for a classical theist perspective. But another one along the lines of what you and I are talking about that I think is really good for atheists to read is by David Bentley Hart. It's called The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, Bliss. That I think really helps to elevate people to like that's where it is. I feel like, and there's a parallel here to Catholics and Protestants, uh, that if you're already too far apart, you can't really have a conversation. Like if we're debating about a concept of God that I don't even believe in, it's just not going to be fruitful. Like God is just this cosmic genie holding the universe, who's just a big, powerful person like us. Hart's book, The Experience of God, is really good about what you were talking about, understanding God as being mysticism, but without being totally unintelligible. It's kind of like also if when I dialogue with Protestants, like why be Catholic? Like I don't think it's fruitful to start with Protestants to say, well, here's why you should believe in the papacy, because you can't even like wrap your head around that source of authority unless you start with the idea that, well, what the deposit of faith that's been given to us, it's not confined to the written word. It's been lived out in the liturgy and the sacred tradition and the succession of the apostles through the bishops. Like start you without that foundation, you're just way too far apart, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so this is the aspect of Christianity that I definitely like the most, or that makes the most sense to me, because it doesn't make sense. Maybe to put it that way, it's certainly, this time of year, Christmas, the idea of the incarnation. Because when I think about
Yeah,
God in that sense, it's this unknowable thing, but then the incarnation itself is it's like, well, there's just this kind of Christ figure that's a baby, grows up, and does all these very human type things that I can meet in the Gospels, and that's the side of Christianity that I really like, is like the mystery of the metaphysics combined with the sort
right,
of I don't know, the way that whatever strange things that Christ is doing in the Gospels, the way that they kind of touch me with the humanity, and
right.
give me some basis for acting, or trying to
Yeah.
be a better person or something.
And it's
Um,
well,
oh,
it's
sorry, yeah.
interesting when you compare it, especially like when I compare the earlier accounts of Jesus to like the later apocryphal accounts. That it's so interesting. I always feel like the later apocryphal accounts, like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Philip, like it's almost like they're trying to create a Jesus to appeal to the people of their time and place, because these are much longer accounts filled with legend written in the second and third century. And so when we read it, we see the problems in that it doesn't feel very human or it seems off. It's kind of like when churches build a church to try to please people in the 1970s. It loses its allure pretty quickly. But the canonical gospels, seeing them, I think there's this view of Jesus that's is very timeless in that regard of God becoming man. Now I thought about this though, because some people will bite back at me like, well, you believe Actus Purus doesn't change, but then if he becomes man, he is changing. And there's a lot of nitty gritty you could get into that. But as an author, I've worked on a fiction book for a long time. I don't know if I'll ever finish it. Like I like this analogy from C.S. Lewis that like if God just creates instantly and wills the creation of the universe. It's like I could have a flash of inspiration, Lewis says, to for a story, like a novel. Like the novel I thought of, it kind of did come to me like, oh, I'd love to do this. If I was smart enough, it could all be there in like one flash. And a part of that could be inserting myself into the story at one point, kind of like in Don Quixote. So that's something I do, like, because put the thoughts at ease, and I think, how can Actus Purus like give me a hug, basically?
Yeah, I definitely struggle with understanding any of the way that any of this sort of metaphysics is supposed to work. Like what God has, He is, and there's no like. I mean, I I don't really understand how any of that works, but for me, that's sort of, what I was saying about the bounds of reason before.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, it's even weird to say the bounds of reason, because it's like, well, if I'm putting a bound on reason, it sounds like I'm quite confident of what's on the other side of that. Like
Hmm.
like I know both sides of what a bound is. But yeah, I find all that stuff quite strange. But maybe it might be useful to talk a little bit about, why specifically Catholicism. So
Sure.
so did you become a Catholic out of sort of checking out what churches there were, and
Yeah,
the
I
historical
did look
case?
at others. So when I was 16, I was introduced to Catholic friends. They introduced me to Christianity. That was in the early 2000s. And then I started reading some books and downloading audio of debates online, like early William Lane Craig debates and other things like that, going to the secular web and uh, seeing all of this. And I felt really moved by the historical evidence to at least accept that Jesus was not merely a man, that he's divine. He rose from the dead. He did do miracles to vindicate his ministry. And but from there, I was just kind of stuck where I should go. Like I went to some Protestant churches. I'm a painful introvert, so I actually was more put off by Protestant churches that are very welcoming and friendly and talk to you a bunch. Whereas I liked Catholic churches that kind of ignored you and you went in and you sat at the back. Um, and I liked that ancient, almost like an ancient sense of the liturgy, that it wasn't crafted to please me, but I was like seeing some kind of familial tradition that's been handed on. So I at first was looking, because at first I thought like, oh, I'll just read the Bible and I'll figure it out. But this is something I've had more conversations with Protestants about. I think sometimes we can start with an unfair burden of proof. Like someone who identifies as Protestant will say, well, yeah, I believe in the Bible, believe in Jesus. You're Catholic, you believe in the Bible, you believe in Jesus. If you can't prove Catholicism, then I'm fine sticking where I am in Protestantism. But to me, I don't think that works. That the analogy between Protestantism and Catholicism, to me, is like the analogy between atheism and Christianity. Classical atheism, like God does not exist. You can't get that just by disproving like theism. Instead, you got three things. You've got atheism, theism, agnosticism. And I would say, with leaving off orthodoxy for a second, you've got Catholicism, Protestantism, well, orthodoxy, we'll put them in there. And then what I would call just mere Christianity. Like, I just know Jesus rose from the dead, and that's it. If you take a minimal facts approach, if you will. Like, what do I believe now? It's like, do I believe here's the Bible? Who says? It's these particular books, and this is how it's generally interpreted. And I feel like, hold on a minute, if you're Protestant, you got a bag of traditions also. The Catholics have a bag of traditions, the Orthodox have that. So I feel like everybody's got their bag of traditions that they want to sell to me. So then I try to figure out, okay, which ones have the best historical pedigree? So for me, it seemed pretty clear Protestantism gets cut off pretty early, and then it kind of comes down to Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Very neck and neck, though, between each other. That's why I always find it, I get so peeved when I see, we talked about this a little before the show, actually, like certain people online, like in Catholicism, it would be the rad trads or trads. In Orthodoxy, it would be the orthobros. Like, whenever I see someone online engaging me and they have like either a crusader icon with Deus Vult, or like Pepe the Frog as an Orthodox priest, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to enjoy this. I'm not going to enjoy this at all. That are so triumphalist about their position, when actually, no, it's like, I'm kind of in line with like Eric Ibarra, who's a really great Catholic apologist, studied Orthodoxy like nobody's business, in the papacy. That he says there's a lot of evidence for Orthodoxy and for Catholicism. He just thinks that overall Catholicism comes out with more, but he doesn't make a grand claim. So I mean, that's kind of a sweep of it for me. We can drill down anywhere you want, but
I think one of the things that is maybe distinguishing or difficult about Catholicism is, in order to become a member of the church, it seems like it puts more of a demand on one's personal life and conduct. Like, if you don't live a very particular way, then you can't be in the church, really, or you'll be, there's particular kind of categories of sin and stuff that you'll be in. Never mind being confirmed into the church, or baptized into the church, if but in terms of the way that the church looks at the sort of corporate side of how it governs the members of the church and stuff like that, it seems like there's more of a tangible aspect to that. And so, in terms of looking at the evidence, then I think that means for someone like me, it becomes more maybe it raises the burden in some sense for Catholicism over other denominations, because the thought is, well, if I'm to become a Catholic, then
right.
there's even more reforms I'd have to make to my life than there almost are for other denominations. I mean, particularly Protestant denominations in general. And so there's like a higher burden of evidence that are going to have to be really confident that this, passage about giving Peter the keys of the kingdom or something is, it
Right.
means this rather than that. I mean, do you think that is reasonable, or do you think the burden should sort of be the same for?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm kind of torn on this, because I think like something is true regardless of how it personally affects us. Like, I've heard atheists say this before. It's like, well, this isn't just believing that Jesus rose from the dead, because if he rose from the dead, I have to dramatically change my life. And because of that, I need more evidence to believe in this kind of thing. But I don't know, like, imagine, um, imagine if, I've tried to put the analogy in my head in different ways, that you read an article in Consumer Reports about a brand of paint you've never heard of, that it causes cancer. Now, a lot of times we flip through a magazine, we read these kind of things, we just assume, well, it's a generally trustworthy magazine, and usually it's right. So yeah, I believe that, if it's a generally trustworthy news magazine that I read. Um, but then, like, imagine then if somebody said, "Oh, your house is painted in that paint." On the one hand, I would think, I'm not going to be like, well, I'm not going to be all skeptical. I'd have to painting my house is a big deal. I'm going to need more evidence on something like this. And I wouldn't have like a standoffish attitude. If anything, I'd be like, oh wow, this really, because this affects me, I'm grateful to have discovered this truth. But at the same time, I understand that if I were in that position, yeah, I might read another article just to make sure, because I'm exerting more effort. But so I would be careful about this kind of idea that belief X has dramatic consequences for my life. Therefore, I don't need more evidence for X. I just need to be certain of X. I don't know if this is making sense.
Yeah, I think it does make sense. So the idea is something like that. Well, whatever is true is the case. So the burden shouldn't sort of like change because it places more sort of demands on you or something.
Hmm.
And I think that that does also sound right to me in some way. But then I think about maybe there's something missing. Like if you take a lateral flow COVID test or something, and
Hmm.
it comes up and shows that you've got COVID, there's something about, well, I'm going to have to spend the next 2 weeks isolating, or maybe I'll lose money from my job or something. So I want to take another one to be sure or something. It's, and it's like, what is that? Is that a rational thought? It's like, well, if I've got the evidence and I'm sure it's right. Well, maybe it's different because there's false positive, but you might get a false positive. But it isn't evidence, historical evidence like that. Maybe there's this book that I just haven't read. Maybe one more book and my
Hmm.
opinion
But
changes.
then it's like the COVID analogy. It would be like, okay, I get a negative test, but what if it's because in the positive one, you're worried
Right,
about a false positive, but then do people worry, what if it's a false negative and I go around
right.
and I infect people and I kill them? It's interesting. Most people will not have that thought and then get another test just to make sure that they're negative.
Hmm.
So maybe there in that case, the cost I don't mind as much because other people are carrying it, in that I might just get other people sick. But with a false negative, the people who will bear the cost are others. Whereas with the false positive, I bear the cost. So I want to kind of make sure. So it might be the difference between evidence and certitude in that regard. So my I guess my thought here on this is, yeah, it's I'm of two minds about it. So I understand we ought to take care with evidence, but I would also say don't let the fact be that it's going to change your life turn into a rationale or a way to make excuses to not have to deal with it. Because sometimes, and then also, it might also be helpful to take a step back and be like, well, are the changes good for me? It's like if I was dating my wife, Laura, and then we're going to get married. Laura has made me a better person, like showing me, hey, I should probably save for retirement, or I probably shouldn't eat McDonald's every day. Now it's just every other day, like that to be married to her, I just can't live my slobbish bachelor life. I would be making a lot of changes, but I don't use it as like, I need more evidence to make sure this girl is right. If anything, the changes that she's calling me to are legitimately good for me. So it's all kind of like a package deal. So that might be one way when you think about Christianity or Catholicism. Well, what are these changes? Are they good for me? Whether it's and the two kinds of changes I would imagine would be either positive duties like going, you're obliged to go to mass or divine liturgy once a week, or negative duties like you can't do X. And each of those is difficult in kind of their own way.
I think that this might be where, in terms of taking those other things into consideration, maybe there's a kind of circularity here that gets at those. I do, not like what Jay Dyer was saying, but I do think there's something that I'm currently reading John Henry Newman's essay in aid of a grammar of assent, and some of the
Mm.
things he says about sort of almost there's a point. There are certain things, like Great Britain as an island, which they're not really believed as a result of evidence, but they will inform the way that you sort of come to see other pieces of evidence. And I think in the case of,
Hmm.
the question, well, would being a Catholic make me a better person or whatever? It's almost like, well, if I was a Catholic, I would see it that way, because I'd be buying this story about, you know, the graces that the church is giving me,
Right.
about having, you know, some form of soul, however you cash that out in terms of metaphysics,
Right.
about maybe some kind of virtue theory about virtues and vices, and, you know, the ecclesial community sort of encouraging me to be that person that you know, stays in kind of the mean between excess and I forget the correct word, and not having, you know, not having some attribute at all.
Right.
Um,
Excess and absence or whatever. Yeah.
right. But I don't know, you know, I don't know that I would necessarily buy that story if I almost wasn't already convinced of
Hmm.
Catholicism to some extent. I mean, maybe I'd buy some form of virtue ethics, but I don't know that I'd buy the idea that that, you know, those ends couldn't be achieved through some secular body or something. Like, it doesn't have to be the Catholic Church that would
Right.
help me to become a virtuous person, or it wouldn't be you know, the graces, because there wouldn't be this theological story in place.
Right.
And similar, yeah. So in terms of considering whether or not it's good for me, it almost becomes difficult to really assess that without just reaching the conclusion that you sort of already hold to some degree, because the way that you view morality is gonna, the way that you view what's good for a person is going to shift dramatically, whether you're in the Catholic Church or outside of it.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying here. So I feel like if you notice these positive elements, like let's say you have to change moral behavior, and that's a cost, then so you wonder, is that cost worth it to pay for belief in this? And I think that, so the elements we talked about previously are that, well, if it's true regardless, then truth is good in and of itself, and so you ought to assent to that, though you might want to check it over once or twice just to be sure. But then we could look at those moral changes. I think the example I was getting at of them being good would not be so much to fall into a circular reasoning trap of seeing that they're good and this is the only way that I can get them, but more as a way of looking at things that were once perceived as obstacles, that maybe they're not as onerous as barriers. That all of the story, it kind of does fit together. Now, what you're saying is, well, one, in looking at the positive elements, let's say even in Catholicism, maybe they could just go and be an Aristotelian natural law theorist, and they get their virtues from Stoicism, and they're doing all this great kind of stuff, and they don't have to have that religious backing to it. And I see what's coming for that. So I think looking at the positive elements, they end up being necessary, but not necessarily sufficient when you have to look at all of the data and all of the claims. And that's where I think when we talked about earlier about ways of coming to know things apart from just strict rational arguments, I think sometimes there's other things that will pop in there, like the liturgy, the lives of the saints, all of that put together. I think for a lot of people, when they change worldviews, you know, it happens gradually. There might be one little moment where they see the click, where there's just a click. Not everything comes together, but the major parts do. And then they make all the connections a little bit um, after that. So I guess so for you, are you're just kind of at the point where you're like, hey, I love this Eastern Orthodox liturgy, mystery, approaching the essence of being itself, and it's just kind of nice being on this periphery and just kind of see where it goes, I guess.
Well, in terms of how I personally think about it, I mean, I read the Bible devotionally, right? And
Hmm.
I, you know, and I pray and stuff like that. I just, my issues stem sort of from not being able to make rational sense of sort of almost any of the metaphysical or even the, you know, the miraculous claims
Hmm.
in terms of the scope of those claims and what they mean. I just can't get my head around them to any extent where I have
Hmm.
like a rational degree of certainty in them, like I would, you know, a scientific hypothesis or something like that. And but that whole thing is what's led me to model what's going on in religious conversion and model the way that beliefs sit together in a different way than I thought about them before, which is sort of part of what was motivating that previous question, because I think the way, something that you said about these things kind of click is, I think there's almost these different, at least from where I'm sitting, there's these sort of different gestalts I can look at something through, like, like the duck rabbit picture where you see it as a duck and you see it as a rabbit. And theism and atheism are kind of like that, where I can look at I can look at events that happen in my life, and there's two competing. I can look at reality or the narrative that I tell myself about how it's going, and be like, yeah, okay, this is, I feel good about doing that thing because some story about evolution maybe, or some story about chemicals in my brain, or I can say, I feel good about doing this because there's this intrinsic goodness to the situation. There's like degrees of being to reality. I cash out the metaphysics in terms of some kind of theism. And the thing that I'm sort of wondering is, well, how does that belief change happen? And the way I've been thinking about it is, like you said, you sort of go to church and stuff, and maybe you get socialized into a set of practices. Your desires change in certain ways, and there's almost foundational, quite foundational beliefs in the way that you're looking at reality that just shift, but for irrational reasons. It's nothing nothing to do with, maybe it is for some people. Maybe for some people it's like, I just can't conceive of an infinite chain of causal motors. There has to be a God or something. But at least in the case of conversion and deconversion, I keep seeing this sort of pattern of, it's more people just change over time due to these irrational causes, and then all of a sudden it's like the perception of reality is just shifted, and it clicks in this different way.
And I think that makes sense, because like you talked about those arguments, like the arguments for and against the existence of God. When you debate them and when you drill into them, ultimately, I think where people are going to disagree is we're going to disagree on like fundamental principles where we don't have a clear-cut way to decide who's right. Just things will either seem one way to people or they'll seem another. People will have certain moral or metaphysical intuitions, like about the principle of sufficient reason, or the impossibility of an infinite regress. And for some people, infinite regress doesn't bother them. For other people, it keeps them up at night. So it's like when you were saying about like, what keeps you difficulty with like Catholicism or orthodoxies, wrapping one's head around the metaphysical claims, that's where I am at with like atheism. Like, because I do believe that it is naturalism, I guess I should say, has metaphysical claims I really, really can't wrap my head around, that pushes me in the other direction. But what you said about the Gestalt pictures, I thought is interesting, because I see where you're coming from. Just to reiterate for our audience, it's like that picture of the duck rabbit, or the young lady and the old woman. It's a picture that I think, well, I don't know, Wittgenstein talked a lot about this, I think a little bit, that there are pictures where you look at the picture. The duck rabbit's a good example. If you look one way, you see a duck. You look another way, you see a rabbit. But you can never see a duck and a rabbit at the same time. You can only see one or the other. And so when you look at the world around us, I could see like, oh, I can see the sky proclaims the greatness of God, Psalm 19:1. Or I can also see astrophysics and, chemicals, like you're saying. Like I could tell two explanatorily sufficient stories, some people might feel like. Because I think that's where the Christian theologian John Hick talked about reality as being kind of ambiguous in that way in his own theology. Although I don't know if the analogy works super great, because for me, either theism or atheism is true. It must be either theism or atheism. But with the duck rabbit picture, it is neither duck nor rabbit. What truly exists is an object that is neither duck nor rabbit, but appears to be both. But I can't say that the universe is neither theistic or atheistic, but appears to be both, because it has to be one or the other. That's where I think the analogy, it seems different to me.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying there. I mean, I think, so supposing one's sort of committed to the law of non-contradiction or whatever, like someone's going to have to think, well, it can't be both a duck and a rabbit. Either it's a duck or not a duck, or either it's a rabbit or not a rabbit, right? And maybe it turns out that it's not a duck and it's not a rabbit, and it's it's some different kind of object, like this vague object altogether. And I think there's something, I think I think I'm similarly committed, to it, they can't both be true at the same time. But I think maybe the objection, or it's not an objection in the sense that I'm saying, you can't rationally disagree with me, but
Right.
it's an objection in the sense of, the thing that causes me to not sort of adopt a position similar to yourself maybe is
Mhm.
it's this kind of epistemic objection really to, well, I can't tell between them, so in principle I can't make that commitment, okay, reality in and of itself is one way or the other, but there's this sort of epistemic problem where that both
Well,
stories account for the appearances, and so yeah, maybe if
Well,
you want.
what's interesting though is I feel like we're starting to tread a little bit into Pascal's wager, possibly, where if you get into a position where especially if your epistemic uncertainty is like 50-50, where it's like, because I mean, this happens a lot when I see online, both Christians and atheists botch Pascal's wager. That, well, it's like Pascal's saying, believe in God and you won't go to hell. And hey, that's a safe bet. Like, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying, if I could summarize it briefly, would just be, look, if you are genuinely on the fence between Christianity and atheism, and both seem equally likely, then believe the one you want to be true. And for Pascal, he would encourage Christianity because you'd have nothing to lose and you would have much to gain. So I do not think that it is because you'll hear atheists like, oh, I can't believe without evidence. Like, huh, come on, we believe all kinds of things all the time, and we don't consult scientific journals. Um, like, I guess maybe I make like this analogy, like I can make like one or two analogies. Like maybe you've read about Nick Bostrom from Oxford about whether the
Right.
universe is a simulation, or you've read David Benatar on whether antinatalism, like, is life really worth living? And like you're like on the fence. You're like, or let's say like antinatalism. It's like, oh, I've read Benatar and I don't know, I could see life being worth living and having kids or not having kids. I'm really right on the fence, but like deep down in your heart, you'd be like, I really would like to have a family. And I might say, well, go with the one you want to be true. It doesn't seem like you could really lose if you're right on the fence there. I don't believe it's a good idea to believe what you want to be true. This is what we said earlier. It's not a good idea to believe what you want to be true if there's like countervailing evidence to show you're like deluded. But especially if epistemically you're like on the fence, I think you could make that kind of pragmatic argument in that regard, and it's fair to do. What do you think?
No, I do think that makes a lot of sense, particularly in, because I think the faith commitment, it's born out as a commitment to a personal entity, right, God, and so
Mhm.
um, it's very similar to marriage, I think, in a lot of ways, in terms of,
Yeah.
there's this kind of gravity, and there's this sort of it what's the word, like, that this inconclusiveness of the evidence, like you're never gonna, but you sort of, you have to make some decision almost. I mean, you could just not make a decision, but the, it sort of presses itself upon you. You can't just wait
Yeah.
forever and never get
But
married.
not making a decision is making a decision. I've noticed sometimes when I like in discourse on atheism, and I think a lot of atheists and others too who subscribe to naturalism or at least skepticism, there is an inbuilt like when we try to figure out our beliefs. I remember when I was debating Matt Dillahunty, um, and he said this before. I think he said it during the debate. Like, my goal is to have as many true beliefs as possible and as few false beliefs. And I would think, but those are actually going in two separate directions. So, I mean, if you because it seems like when you maximize one, you minimize the other. Like, if you try to have a ton of true beliefs, false beliefs will sneak in there. But if your goal is, I'm going to have as few false beliefs as possible, you're going to shut out true beliefs. You see how, like, if it becomes in like different directions. So I think sometimes with
Yeah,
God and religion, there is this idea with epistemology uh, that there is a greater fear of adopting a false belief than in failing to adopt a true belief. As if more harm will come to me if I adopt a
right.
false belief than failing to adopt what's true. So it's kind of like with the COVID example we talked about. It's like it'd be worse for me to think I have COVID when I don't than to have COVID when I think I don't almost. But I understand in different contexts there's different harms to weigh them. But I think sometimes in these debates, like especially with atheists and on in Christianity, there's almost a sense the only harm comes from adopting false beliefs. We got to watch out for those. But you could be greatly impoverished by failing to adopt a true belief that's very good for you. So, like with marriage, someone might be like, I can't marry because what if this girl is just the total witch? Like she is just absolutely awful. I don't want to end up with a witch. So I am just not going to get married. I'm going to avoid the false belief. Well, but then the problem is you might end up being a sad, lonely old bachelor, and you missed out on a good true belief of a wife who is good for you. So I think that that's something that also has to be taken into consideration when we're wrestling with this. There are harms with adopting false beliefs, but there's also grave harms in failing to get true beliefs, especially if it's of high importance, like these kind of worldview questions we're talking about.
Yeah, I do. I think I agree with that as well. Um, I mean, maybe I ought to think more about a Pascal's wager type argument, because I haven't given it a whole lot of sort of thought, but I certainly agree with some of the things you're saying. I do find though that one of the things I find most compelling about Pascal, and this sort of speaks to my view of Christianity maybe as a whole, is
Mm-hmm.
the note that was found sewn in his jacket pocket after he died, which was I forget the exact contents, but it's something like 9 o'clock on Thursday, the whenever of whatever year, fire, 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 joy, joy, and he's saying, not the God of the philosophers, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his and he, I think there's something like remember this, God really does exist, and it seems to me that like a religious experience like that for someone like Pascal, seems to be that seems to be like the real deal, as it were, that and similarly the moments where I would say the moments in my life that are the most plausible candidates for
Yeah.
providence or something like that, it's so different from this kind of detached metaphysical reasoning about things,
Yeah.
and I think that there is this real tension between the two for me, where it's like, the story of the incarnation being so human, the call to live my life in a particular way morally, to really sacrifice myself and in pursuit of these sort of really good goals. I mean, that all seems so different to me to this sort of talk of, first causes, and is the A theory or B theory time true? Da, da, da.
Sure.
But that's the Christianity that also speaks to my heart as well. And I wonder if you had any thoughts, because your
Mhm.
apologetic style, I suppose, really focuses on that intellectual,
Yeah.
rational aspect. Do you think that that's the wrong approach for me to take, and I should probably be thinking more do you think that that's missing almost from the way I'm looking at these things, the rational aspect, or should I keep
Yeah.
pursuing it through that thing that's appealing to me?
No, I don't think it's either or. I think it's something that both of us should engage in with our whole being, whether it's the intellectual, the non. I like the term non-rational. Ways of being disposed towards certain things. I think that we should look at it in both. There's a Protestant philosopher, Josh Rasmussen, who I think is also another very excellent Christian theistic philosopher, and he talks about like kind of like great story theodicies. Uh, and I think that some of these, like, it's interesting you're saying that the A or B theory of time, PSR, all these nitty gritty elements to everything. I believe they have their place, but if you start with that or you get hung up on that, you can lose the forest for the trees. It's like the people, I don't know if this analogy will work, but here we go. It's like I enjoy Star Wars, for example. Um, but sometimes you can get too, or Star Trek or whatever, you could get so much into the trivia and the particular details and then gripe about things or get so worked up about the details that you miss the great story that attracted you in the first place. Now, it's quite all right, though, if you have beheld the great story to try to understand these little details that help to fill everything in and for it to make sense. So I think like for me, like the apologetics that I do, like I wish that I could evangelize and like capture people's imaginations to like be a part of the great story and just have like, I don't know, help people connect to God in that non-rational way. But I don't, because I can't give what I don't have. I don't really connect a ton in that way. It's a lack for me. I do connect in a lot of these rational arguments, and they all fit together. So I kind of try to just give what I have. And so for me, I find all of these pieces, I guess it's the inner nerd in me. I see the great story, but I love figuring out how the great story all works together in these little parts of it. And then when they all come together, it just makes the story so much more interesting. It'd be like the person, I just took my kids out to see Christmas lights the other night. And they're amazed by seeing all the lights, and I'm wondering, how do they get the circuits to do this and that? And what if one bulb goes out? How does it not fail to keep the rest going? I think there's a place to look at the little things for the big picture to work, and one should do that, but one should not lose sight of the big picture. And sometimes just take a few steps back and look at the lights for a minute. Just look at the lights and just enjoy them, and then it'll all make sense. So I don't know if that makes
No,
sense.
well, I mean, yeah, for all you were saying about not being able to sort of connect to the bigger story, I think that was quite a poetic metaphor to to put forward.
I think I'm
Does
able to be poetic now because my kids keep me up, so I only sleep for like 3 hours. So I'm just like everything's just all
Okay.
scatterbrained in there, anyways. But yeah, I think it's good to look at these kind of things, but it's always dangerous, and it's also dangerous for apologists, for like committed Christians to become junkies that just only do arguments, and
Right.
especially if they
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
even just do. I would even be okay if they just studied philosophy, but if they're just yelling at people on social media, just take a step back from all that. So I would say to look at that, but I think also just to understand, like with these arguments, you already, I mean, I've seen some of your videos. You know a lot about all these arguments. I don't believe anyone should have to. No one should have to have a PhD in philosophy to believe in
To be a
God.
Christian, yeah.
They don't. But I think that where one's knowledge of philosophy helps, let it help and connect to God in these different ways. But I think as long as someone is pursuing God in a non-rational way that does not become irrational, they ought to be free to do that and to just keep a balance in the different ways they relate to God. So I would say, like, if prayer, going to the divine liturgy, reading scripture in a devotional way, just thanking God. I think one of the problems for atheism is the problem of gratitude, and just to be able to indulge, like, when you see beauty in the world, to have that hearty thanks for it being here. The flip side of that, of course, is, who do you blame? Does that mean I get to blame somebody when there's ugliness in the world? Well, for me, it's helpful. Like, well, then that means there's a way to redeem, like, the great story, this great story paradigm. I believe in that, because otherwise we're just stuck in there's going to be a downer ending probably. So I think like the problem of evil can fit into this as well.
So, I mean, there's interesting questions about all of that stuff, but maybe if you've got time for 10 minutes or so, there's some questions from the chat
Oh
that
yeah,
people have
yeah,
been putting
sure,
throughout.
absolutely.
So, one question from Ronald, and thanks for the super chat, was, please ask Mr. Horn what he knows about God, not what he believes.
Sure. Well, I would say, while it's an imperfect definition, I would say that knowledge is justified true belief. So to know something just means you have a belief about something and it's true, and you have justification. And justification does not entail that you have to have 100% certainty. Like, I look on my phone right now, I look at the weather app. Let me see here. So back home in San Diego, it says it's raining on here, back in my old town. So I might say, well, I know it's raining back home. I think I know that. Can I prove it to you right now? No, I mean, I could call somebody there and they could confirm it, but I don't have 100% proof. I've got justification. So I could say with God, there are things that I believe about God, and I would say that they're true, and I have justification, so I have good reasons. So I would say that I know God exists. I know God is unchangeable, eternal, all powerful. God became man. I would say I know these things, even if I don't have 100% certainty. Now, however, I will say there are some things, like knowing. I would say that I don't know what it's like to be God, or I don't know exactly how God operates, if you will, in certain things that are mysterious, like how God creates from nothing or the inner workings of the Trinity. So there are mysteries there. But I reject the idea that, belief and knowledge's got to be this, this very separate thing from belief, when I would say knowledge is a subset of belief. So that's how I might answer that question.
There was a comment about, in a court of law, the amount of evidence that you might require to condemn someone to life in prison might significantly increase because of what's at stake. I think that was when we were talking about, like whether burdens of evidence, whether they sort of change
Yeah.
with the stakes.
Well, that's interesting here. And I've heard this before, that sometimes, we will set different standards of evidence based on what is at stake. Or I think more so based on what we are trying to avoid. So in the Western world, we've inherited a principle from Roman law, which would be the idea that the worst thing the justice system can do is to punish an innocent person. There's that old Roman phrase. It is better that 10 guilty people should go free than that an innocent person should be punished. Not all, maybe there could be societies that don't hold to that view. They might say it's better to make sure you get the guilty, even if the innocent get caught up in the dragnet. We don't hold to that view. It's a particular value judgment in our culture that we would rather many guilty people go free than punish an innocent person. I don't know why. I mean, that's a Roman view, but we might have adopted it in Christianity because we feel like if we don't catch him in this life, maybe God will get him in the next life. And so we're kind of okay with that. So that's why in a criminal case where someone is at risk of losing their liberty, for example, we require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I was actually on the pool of a I was sorry. I was part of the jury selection process for a murder trial a few years ago. I didn't want to be there, so I was just totally transparent in how I felt, and they disqualified me. I didn't lie, but I was very transparent. And they talked about burden of proof, reasonable doubt. They said, look, reasonable doubt, it's not 100%, but it just means that beyond a reasonable doubt means if I believe this guy's guilty today, I'll believe that 5 years from now, 20 years from now, 40 years from now, I'll still believe that. May not be 100%, but it's high 90s. In a civil case, what's interesting, where you're more at the loss of your property, it's actually the burden of proof is 51%, the preponderance of evidence. So I think that we have to keep that into account, like with the beyond reasonable doubt standard is crafted to avoid culturally an outcome we really, really abhor, which would be punishing of the innocent. So I would say, though, that when we're trying to figure out our worldviews, ideas do not deserve the same care as persons. And this will go back to, once again, uh, the failure of adopting beliefs and the harm that might be involved there, to keep that both in regards.
Thank you. There was another question about the gospel authorship and the Catholic view of who the gospel authors are. Is there an official Catholic position? And I guess as well about maybe about ordering as well, if that you'd
Yeah.
include that.
Yeah, so there used to be disciplinary teachings that came from the Pontifical Biblical Commission back in the early 20th century, when form criticism was kind of at its zenith, and there were concerns about how one ought to teach about the New Testament and how to engage the historical critical method. So I would just say that the church has defined that the Gospels that we know as, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are gospels, and there are no other gospels that have been given the designation of being canonical or having inspired scripture. However, when it comes to other questions, such as what is the precise identity of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, that is something the church has not defined. Pope Benedict XVI, for example, in his book Jesus of Nazareth, he talks about the Gospel of John, and he even talks about the hypothesis that the Gospel of John, it is the memories of the Apostle John, but they are preserved in a later writer that was known in the early church as the priest John or presbyter John, who I think Pope Benedict refers to him as like the faithful executor of the Apostle John's testimony. So like who wrote it, you can hold the view, Mark and Luke, I don't really see too many derivations there. Usually the debate in academia is about Matthew and John. Is it the Apostle Matthew and the Apostle John, or somebody else writing under their name? The church hasn't answered that question. When it comes to ordering, once again, the PBC declarations talked about not allowing at the time for teaching that Mark is prior, but the church now doesn't hold those as disciplinary teachings, that biblical scholars are free to pursue a wide variety of responses to the so-called synoptic problem of trying to understand the relationship between the sources in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel. And you'll find Catholic biblical scholars that hold to Markan priority. You'll find some that hold to the traditional Augustinian view that Matthew is first. You'll find scholars that are divided over Q, for example. So it's the church allows a fair amount of freedom in that regard when it comes to biblical studies.
I'm just scrolling down to catch up with the chat. Do you believe in transubstantiation and infallibility of the Pope? Can you not believe in either of these and still be a Catholic?
These would be teachings that would be considered de fide. These are teachings that have been infallibly defined at ecumenical councils. And so because of that, a Catholic is bound to accept them under penalty of sin. You cannot deny these teachings. Now, not every teaching has this high level of authority to it. But one is bound to accept those teachings that have been infallibly defined to have been divinely revealed. That would be dogma. So these teachings are defined. The reality of transubstantiation is defined at the Fourth Lateran Council, and the infallibility of the Pope would be defined at the First Vatican Council. Now, to be fair, if you're a theologian, one could offer different proposals for understanding, for how we ought to understand maybe transubstantiation, or under what specific condition. Now, there's basic conditions you can't deny, but there might be ways of articulating how we understand the Pope carries out the charism of infallibility. But you would be obliged to believe these teachings. But I would hesitate for someone to erroneously think that there is some kind of because there might be something a theologian speculated on related to these teachings that is not an essential part of it. I would recommend for our listeners, if they want to get a greater view of this, my colleague and friend Jimmy Akin has a book called Teaching with Authority, and it goes through how the Catholic Church delivers its teachings, because the teachings have different levels of authority. They can range from theological speculation that the church tolerates but doesn't have an opinion on. It can be something that the church teaches but has not infallibly defined, and so it's subject to later development. Or it could be something the church has brought an end to the discussion of the doctrine and has now infallibly defined it. We see this, for example, with the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that throughout most of church history, this is something theologians might speculate about. It becomes something later on in the millennia that it's more of a doctrine that is taught, but not in a definitive way. Then in the 19th century, it is definitively taught. But I'd recommend Jimmy Akin's book, Teaching with Authority, to get a greater clarity on that issue, on these issues.
So one last quick question then, and you've engaged with him before, but he's not been able to contain himself in the chat. Pine Creek Doug has asked, is there anything in the New Testament that reads as history, but that you think probably didn't happen in the past?
So I guess Doug's question, and I know I've said that I haven't been as interested in engaging Doug before. He has an interesting sense of humor, and he's taken some criticisms of recent things I've done with his particular way of doing that, which is fine. Everyone has their own way of doing things. So the question seems to be, is there? I guess I would ask Doug, like, well, what is history? So if history is a record of things that happened in the past, it sounds like the question is there anything in the New Testament that reads as an event that happened in the past, but it was not an event that actually happened in the past? Um, and there's a possibility. Let me go through a few things here. One thing might be particular stories or illustrations that individuals in the New Testament uh, recount. So I think that when Jesus talks about the parable of the prodigal son, some people may interpret that as he's talking, it's describing something that happened, but it's a story. It didn't actually happen. Another one might be when, if Jesus talks about Jonah being in the belly of the whale or the fish for 3 days, that doesn't mean, it may be the case that the story of Jonah is allegorical or it's a didactic fiction. So even if Jesus talks about Noah and the flood or the story of Jonah, it may be the case that he is using this didactic fiction to make a particular point about his own ministry. And it doesn't have to have actually happened for him to make that point. Like if I say Jesus is stronger than Superman, that's true, even though Superman is a fictional character. Now, Doug might be saying, well, no. I'm talking about an event, not just a New Testament individual telling a story about the Old Testament. Maybe he's saying that there is something, uh, an episode in the New Testament that sounds like it is something that happened, but it didn't actually happen. And off the top of my head, I would say that if something appears to be a historical description um, in the New Testament, I'm not inclined to say that it did not happen. The only I could maybe say, for example, that like the descriptions of, like, let's say Jesus being baptized, because the Father says a different thing in every description, I might say that this appears to be a historical account, but it's not a literal one. It's not a transcription of what was actually said. So something might appear to be strict history to a reader in the modern age in the New Testament, but it's written in the standards of ancient history. So you're getting more the gist of what happened without all of the specific details. Maybe another example that Doug might bring up or others might be like, what do I think of at the end of Matthew's gospel? In After Jesus's crucifixion, it talks about the curtain in the temple being torn and the saints rising from their graves. Like, do I think that actually happened? I wouldn't mind even reading that just to have that as let's see it that. Oh, here we go. Matthew 27:51 through 52. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Coming out of their tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city, appeared to many. Um, do I think that this happened? Well, I am. I will not completely discount the idea that this is kind of apocalyptic rhetoric. And so it might sound historical, but it isn't. I won't completely discount that idea. I think the Pontifical Biblical Commission is open to that, but I don't see a need to read it in that way. Uh, I think when some people read this passage, they say, "Oh, well, it talks about an army of zombies going into Jerusalem." Well, I don't know if even like 3 or 4 people who had died had come back to life, had gone into the city. Well, that's many dead people to me. I mean, I think that these individuals, it's probably similar to the raising of Lazarus, for example, or the raising of Jairus's daughter. I don't think that they were, it's not like the skeletons in was that old movie Jason and the Argonauts. So the skeletons come up and do stuff. I think that this may be similar to where you have like Lazarus came out from the dead and people are like, "Oh, wow." And that's not recorded in every gospel account. So this you might have similar, maybe it's like 3 or 4 Lazarus episodes and these people come back and they're dressed like regular ordinary people. They had just died. And so they would only be recognized by their friends and family that they go and see. So I know that was a lengthy question, but
Well, my internet dropped out, so
oh,
it was
so
good
that's
to.
all right. But you're back. So,
Yeah.
but I'm grateful that Doug asked the question, and then yeah, then I hope he keeps up his work of asking good questions and engaging apologetics, and I hope that we can all just ask good questions in that regard to get at the truth.
My suspicion is if you said anything that he doesn't like, it will end up as a clip, and the clip will begin with me saying this because it's happened before. But
Yes, and that's why yeah, I have seen some things like that, and I'm okay with a good meme that pops
yeah,
up.
yeah,
But I do think these are really serious questions for people. Things that people agonize over, whether it comes to leaving their faith or converting, ultimate questions about eternity. And we should treat that seriously, both for Doug to do that, but also for other people. I really don't like it when Christians I cannot stand it when there are Christians who talk about atheists as if they're just idiots. And they'll tell me, why do you bother with these people, these morons? I'm like, well, that's not a charitable thing to say. And also, it kills me when these people will say atheists are a bunch of idiots. And then atheists online will tell them, well, prove God exists. And they'll just say something like, read Aquinas, you dummy. And I'm like, you
yeah.
can't even meet the challenge. You can't even meet the challenge. And you go around acting like this with your hubris. So I would just say all of us, it's always important to try to generate more light than heat, and to treat these questions with a sense of importance of how important they are to so many people.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think from Doug's point of view, he sees Christianity as a sort of dead option. He's very confident that it isn't true, and so doesn't feel any sort of, I don't know, moral obligation or whatever to kind of entertain what he sees as people's false beliefs. But
Well,
I mean,
then what I
that's not
would
the case from where I'm standing. But
I don't know. So I mean, if he said on his show before he doesn't see it as a moral duty to deconvert people. I think he just enjoys a lot of
yeah,
times poking fun at apologists, either for being pop apologists with contradictory answers or ones who are more analytic and have studied a lot of the issues. Who maybe he doesn't like the answers are too complicated or things like that. But if he is very convinced that he does this because he's convinced that it's false, and he would like other people to know that, I'd be happy to engage him at least in a debate type format where we can focus on a particular question, like is it reasonable to believe Jesus rose from the dead? And he can put forward the arguments for people to consider, and we could have more of a structured exchange. Because I think that we can't settle a lot of these questions. Like, let's say this question about the New Testament reading as history. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, it's a fun academic exercise to talk about, is the New Testament historical or not? Like,
right.
how much of the Iliad and the Odyssey is historical or not? But at the end of the day, it's nothing to spend that much time over. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, then it's important to really focus on how trustworthy is the message that's been given to us. So with someone like Doug, I'd be more interested in not discussing these secondary points, but maybe like debating like a core issue about whether Christianity is true or not. And he can introduce people to the arguments that make him not think the resurrection is reasonable to believe in. And I could introduce people to the arguments that I find it reasonable. So if he's ever open to that, that's fine with me.
So I want to say I did miss a super chat as well from House of Comments. I want to say thanks for that. And there was I had said that the previous one was to be the last question, but I know Joshua really wanted to ask you this from the start as well. If you've got
Yeah,
5
sure.
minutes or so, just to,
Yeah, of course.
So he wanted to know what your thoughts are on Balthasar's hopeful universalism and universalism's compatibility with Catholic dogma.
Yeah, what I would say is that universalism, the idea that we can have certainty, all people or all creatures will be saved, is something that is incompatible with Catholic teaching. There's a little bit of debate about whether it was properly anathematized in church councils, but it seems very clear to me that that is not a live option for Catholics, universalism. The von Balthasarian position that was outlined, I think, in 2 separate essays, later combined into a single book, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved? That is one that is not strict universalism. It does not say we know everybody's going to heaven. And I don't think either von Balthasar or a modern advocate of it, like Bishop Robert Barron, who departs from von Balthasar on some key ways of articulating it, wouldn't even use the term universalism. They don't like the term hopeful universalism because universalism is essentially a heresy. They don't like the term hopeful universalism. They would rather call it the dare we hope position, I think. And my view of the position is that it is within the bounds of orthodoxy to believe it. If the position is just, it is possible that all human beings will go to heaven, it's possible. Therefore, it's okay to pray for that possibility. If that's the position, I would say, well, it's within the bounds of orthodoxy. It's not heretical. I did a whole podcast on this a while ago. However, I would not bet my life on it. To me, it's possible the dare we hope position is true. In the same sense, it is possible that I will win the Powerball next week. I mean, maybe, but I'm not going to bet my life on it. I'm not going to make it an important part of my worldview because of the significant odds against it, given I think is the biblical and the historical evidences for the doctrine of hell. So I don't think that it's Bishop Barron. I think a lot of people have misunderstood him because he's talked about we can have a reasonable hope that all can be saved. And I think that language makes one think the probability is like 50%, 51%, or even like 10% or 5%. And I don't think a lot of people are willing to go that high. I wouldn't say a reasonable hope. I would call it a rational hope, just that it's not irrational. But I place the probability so low, it's practically negligible. So one could believe it, but I don't see its pragmatic value in that regard.
What in saying it's a heresy, is that because of some particular Catholic council or the Fifth Ecumenical?
Yeah, so there were ecumenical councils in the past. So I guess I should be very careful. The word heresy is a bomb you can throw out there. That seem to anathematize the positions related to the ecclesial writer Origen, and he's seen. It's always hard with these writers to figure out whether they actually held these views or not. To hold to a view called apokatastasis, the idea that all creatures, not just human beings, but that the demons, the devil, would eventually be, everything would be restored and nobody would be in hell. So some people have said that universalism, how you want to define it, that it was condemned at previous councils. No, it's not an ecumenical council. Maybe at the Council of Orange dealing with, well, no, that'd be different. Maybe it was at Orange dealing with Pelagianism and other things. So if it were formally anathematized at one of these councils, it would fall under heresy. Heresy is the obstinate post-baptismal refusal to believe something that has to be held with divine and Catholic faith. It's very specific. So there could be some things that the church teaches, like, for example, that God immediately creates our souls. We don't get our souls from our parents. There have been different views on that in theological history. The church has not defined that. So if you failed to believe God immediately creates our souls and you held to this other view, Traducianism, our souls come from our parents, as long as you believe in original sin and stuff like that, you would not be guilty of heresy. You might be guilty of theological error. You're rejecting something the church is teaching, but it would not be heresy, per se. Has to be something that obstinate. It's what the church teaches. You fail to believe it. You do this after baptism. You refuse to believe this set of beliefs. So universalism may be a heresy in that sense. I'd have to go back through the canons to make sure I got that airtight. Otherwise, I would say it's a clear variance with Catholic doctrine on the nature of hell, and that hell is a real possibility. If universalism were true, hell would not be a possibility. But the dare we hope position allows hell to be one possibility. It just says there's another possibility. Everybody ends up being saved that we can hope for. So I think that it's within the bounds of orthodoxy, but I give it really, really low odds of being true.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on the channel and spending so much of your time having a conversation with me. Is there anything you want to say about what you're working on currently, or where people can go to find out more about you if they want to hear more of your stuff?
Yeah, I would just say they could check out my channel, The Council of Trent. You can get that on YouTube, iTunes, Google Play. I have a series of books out. They're available wherever you can find Catholic books. So I do that podcast, about 4 episodes a week, The Council of Trent. And I'm working on a new book. It's a dialogue with my inner skeptic. So that'll be my first dialogue book. That should be a lot of fun. I just sent it to the publisher, so hopefully that'll be out in a few months.
Right, quite similar to Randall Rouser's My
Yes.
Conversations. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll just play the closing credits, and then if you want to hang around for a minute, you can. But if you've got to head
Sure.
off, that's okay as well.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you, everyone, for watching, and I will see you next time.